Thank you very much. I'm not sure that I quite recognised myself in all of that. You could talk to my husband about whether the devoted wife part is part of it, given that I'm here and he's at home feeding the kids tonight. But it's lovely to be here and a real joy to be speaking to you about beauty and culture. So as soon as Father Greg asked me if I was interested in doing this, I said, well, interested, of course I'm interested. And to be doing so as part of a Lenten program that is really helping us to think about the legacy of the late Holy Father Benedict XVI, who is a tremendous thinker. And the more I think that we now delve into his works, the more I think we'll appreciate just how much he's given us to think about now and into the future. So the topic tonight, why beauty matters, an examination of Catholic culture. I'd like to say that this is Catholic culture for a start, that you've all come together in a church and that you're thinking about things, thinking in particular about beauty tonight. Culture was once explained to me as something that really is very much part of our Catholic tradition, because when you think about really good things that come from culture, and you can think about this on St. Patrick's Day, beer is the product of culture. Yogurt, bread, all of these things that really developed out of monastic life, of people coming together, cheese as well, and being able to develop by taking in from the outside world and really letting over time processes happen. Great things can happen. So we need to be patient with culture, but we have a lot to contribute to culture. And these are some of the ideas that I'll try to talk with you about tonight. I thought that since it's Lent, we'd be very Lenten, and I wouldn't put up a lot of pretty pictures, but you can go and look at them in the Easter season instead. And you'll see that there's a bit of a comment about the fasting of the eyes that happens when we're looking at iconography and the way that iconography works, that before really enjoying an icon that tells us something of the divine, we should first fast the senses so that then we're really open to what it is that is being presented to us in something beautiful. So what I wanted to do tonight, instead of showing you a lot of beautiful artworks and talking you through them, was to go through a text that I have always found very, very helpful from Benedict XVI, but it's a very rich text. In fact, one of my students wrote his entire master's thesis on aesthetics simply by following through the logic of this particular text. So I won't go into the great depth and detail that he went into. You'll be very grateful to hear tonight. But what I wanted to do was just really to give you a bit of the overall narrative, I suppose, of the text, and then to really delve into some different things. Following on from Father Greg's talk last week, which I understand was on relativism, you'll see the theme of relativism is in here because Benedict XVI says that there is a true kind of beauty, but there is also a false kind of beauty. And that false kind of beauty has to do with relativism. And then next week, Father Noel will speak to you about love, eros and agape, and you will see eros and agape working throughout this text as well. So what I'm going to do is to read through bits and pieces, but kind of follow the order of the text, and you have the text with you as well, in order so that you can follow along and you can take it away and read it later if you'd like to. But we're just going to use some certain touchstones, I suppose, of the text as we go through. So this is something that Benedict XVI delivered to the Communion and a meeting of Communion and Liberation in 2002. And it's called The Feeling of Things, the Contemplation of Beauty. And the point that he's really coming from is that philosophers think about, I'm a philosopher by training, so philosophers think about beauty as something that's ingrained in reality. So God made reality out of love for us as a great gift to us, and we're of course part of his whole universe. And when he did so, he made things as they are. Anything that exists is true, is good, and is beautiful, and is unified. These are what philosophers have a fancy term for. We call them the transcendentals. So if anything exists, then it is true, it is knowable, in other words, so we can have ideas about it, we can actually see the reality of a thing, we can know it somehow. And when we do that, we see its purpose, we see how it is good. And we also see we're attracted to that goodness, we're attracted to that truth, and that's where beauty comes in. So beauty is actually a response of love to what God has given us as true and as good. And that's where Ratzinger is really coming from. But what he wants to tell us is that beauty has to be experienced, and it's something that humans have known all along, that when we experience something beautiful, it sets us, it wounds us, is the language that he's going to use. It strikes us. So if you see something truly beautiful, hopefully we've all had moments like this in our lives, then somehow we're taken outside of ourselves and we think, oh my gosh, what is that? This is amazing. This is the kind of sense of beauty that Ratzinger has, that Benedict XVI has, that it's something that strikes us and makes us realize that we actually yearn for something that is beyond ourselves. The Greeks had a certain term for this. They said that that's eros, the kind of love that realizes that we lack something even as we are appreciating something beautiful. And then what happens with Christianity is that we realize that we yearn for something that is actually someone, and that someone is Christ. So what Ratzinger wants us to do is to think about how it is that we can know things like the terms of the transcendentals, and we can know sort of logically how everything works, but actually to really know beauty is to encounter beauty, to experience beauty, and the ultimate experience of beauty is an experience of Christ. But in order to understand that, we have to see that Christ, and this is something very important to think about in Lent as we prepare both for the crucifixion and the resurrection, Christ is a paradox because his beauty can be seen most fully when he is crucified. And to look at a proper depiction of a crucifixion, not knowing what's going on, one might say, well, that is only ugliness. Because Christ crucified is actually a horrific depiction unless we understand why he is crucified and that he is now risen. All right, so this is sort of some of the background of what is then going on in the text. So Benedict begins with looking at the liturgy of the hours for the season of Lent. So this is why I thought it might be appropriate as well. And he says every time he looks at the liturgy of the hours, those prayers that we as a church universally pray together, he says that there's a paradox in the Vespers for Monday of the second week of the Psalter. Here, side by side, are two antiphons, one for the season of Lent and the other for Holy Week. Both introduce Psalm 44, but they present strikingly contradictory interpretations. The psalm describes the wedding of the king, his beauty, his virtues, his mission, and then becomes an exaltation of his bride. In the season of Lent, Psalm 44 is framed by the same antiphon used for the rest of the year. The third verse of the psalm says, "You are the fairest of the children of men, and grace is poured upon your lips." And then we know, he says, or we as Christians see in this depiction Christ. So this is the depiction of the poetic prophetic representation of Christ in his relationship with the church. So we recognize Christ as the fairest of men, the most beautiful person in the entirety of creation. Christ who enters history, who is God who enters history. And we know that everything that he does, everything that he says, points to an inner beauty, that it is even greater than what we see in his outward appearance. The real point of what is the second paragraph in the text is this. He says, "So it is not merely the external beauty of the Redeemer's appearance that is glorified. Rather, the beauty of truth appears in him, the beauty of God himself, who draws us to himself and at the same time captures us with the wound of love, the holy passion, or eros, that enables us to go forth together with and in the church, his bride, to meet the love who calls us." So but it's a very kind of dense couple of sentences there. What is it that he's getting at? So the beauty of truth, whenever something is truly beautiful, and this is what he's going to look at, whenever something is truly beautiful, it is striking. So I can remember once when I was preparing for class and I was trying to find a piece of music to kind of convey this to my students. I looked at Leonard Bernstein, who was conducting a choir as they were singing Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus. And I was sitting at my desk, and I was sort of, there was all of this activity going on in the school and the department that I'm in, and I had the headphones on, and I was holding something, and I dropped it because it was so beautiful. And I remember just closing my eyes and thinking, but this is amazing. And sometimes we do have moments like this, like someone will strike us. You can actually see, and this is something that Ratzinger will work up to, if you see someone do something that is so good, it can bring a tear to your eyes. This sort of a beautiful act of love. Why is it that we cry when something is beautiful? We should be laughing and happy and all this, but somehow beauty, what does it do? It stirs up something in us. And it's that stirring up that Ratzinger is really trying to get at, that something within the human heart is there that is actually unsettled and at the same time very peaceful. And as Catholics, we don't have issues with the fact that this is a paradox, because Catholics actually love paradoxes. We're the both and tradition. It's like it can be, it can stir up all of this, and yet I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. And this is something that he's trying to get at as well. And as he does so, he says, okay, so the next part, which I'll just touch upon briefly, he says, we've looked at the way that Christ is depicted as so beautiful, and then at the same time, in the Monday of Holy Week, the church changes the antiphon, which refers to the same psalm, and says, he had no beauty, neither beauty, no majesty, nothing to attract our eyes, no grace to make us delight in him. This is the same person. So on the one hand, everything that he does is beautiful. Everything that he does is graceful. His lips are glorious. He's an amazing king, and he's there in majesty. The same person has no beauty, no majesty, is unattractive. We cannot delight in him. And yet this is the same person. This is Christ. How can we reconcile this? Asks Ratzinger. The appearance of the fairest of the children of men is so wretched that no one wants to look. No one desires to look at him. Pilate presented him and said, behold the man, to rouse sympathy for the crushed and battered man, in whom no external beauty remained. And yet to the Christian, Christ at this moment is beautiful. How do we reconcile this? And then in a typical Benedict leap, he says, okay, I'm just going to leave that with you, and I'm going to go and get some help from someone else. And he calls in one of his main guys, who was Augustine. So Ratzinger actually wrote one of his doctoral dissertations on Augustine. And Augustine, as he says, wrote a book in his youth about the beauty and the harmonious. And Augustine appreciated beauty in words, in music, in the figurative arts, and had a keen appreciation of the paradox. So he knew that a paradox is a contrast, but not a contradiction. And what Augustine says is that when we're looking at the beautiful, we realise that, so referring to the paradox contained in these texts, Augustine says that two trumpets can be heard, can be blown upon, so two musical trumpets with the same breath of the Spirit can sound two different notes, but it's the same breath of the Spirit that is sounding the two notes. So both quotes come from the same Spirit who inspires the entirety of Scripture, but they sound different. They sound different and point to the same reality. And he says, in this way, Augustine sets us before the totality of true beauty, of truth itself. So sometimes when I'm explaining this to my students, I'll say, what you don't want is beauty that's pretty. If something is too pretty, it's actually not beautiful. I don't know if you've seen, kitsch is kind of like this. You see some paintings where everything is it just doesn't look real. Real beauty is pointing us to the fundamental reality that creation itself was made for goodness but is slightly broken. It points us to that and tells us that we're called to try to fix that brokenness with and through Christ. So in the first place, the text of Isaiah supplies the question that interested people like Augustine, the fathers of the church. Is Christ beautiful or not? When I see Christ on the cross, is he actually beautiful? And Ratzinger goes on to say, implicit here is the more radical question of whether beauty is true or whether actually ugliness is true. So is the world so broken that actually it's all about ugliness, all about evil? Some will say that. Or is it the fact that no, the world is beautiful and good, and it's somehow through the brokenness that we come to appreciate that more? So whoever believes in God, in the God who manifested himself precisely in the altered appearance of Christ, crucified as love to the end, says Ratzinger, knows that beauty is truth and truth beauty. But in the suffering Christ, he also learns that the beauty of truth also embraces offence, pain, and even the dark mystery of death, and that this can only be found in accepting suffering, not in ignoring it. And in that short little sentence there, it seems to me that what we see is a great insight into the contemplative life of Benedict himself, that he was someone so close to Christ that he was able to see this paradox in Christ and to love it and embrace it and to see the whole world through it. So, and as Christians, that's what we're called to do, to see the whole of the world through Christ. And that's why I think he then goes to Greek philosophy. So let me just step back a little bit here. The idea that we have usually within, when we're looking at ideas within the Catholic intellectual tradition, is that the story kind of goes like this. The Greek and Roman philosophers, through the use of reason, were able to get pretty far in figuring out what this whole reality thing is about. But they came to a real standstill because the answer to the meaning of reality is Christ, and Christ had not been revealed to them yet. They were simply too early in history for this to happen. And in fact, some of the church fathers said that some of these philosophers got so far that when Christ descended into hell after, in the period between his crucifixion and his resurrection, we say he descended into hell, and on the third day he rose again from the dead. So that's what we call the harrowing of hell. So he went down into hell and opened the gates of heaven. And I like to think of him saying to Satan, ha, 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 and open the gates. That as soon as some of these ancient philosophers saw Christ, they were immediately Christian, because they were so close to realizing that he was the answer to everything. So in the ancient world, they had come to the point where they said, if we could just understand this concept which we're going to call logos, which means word, communication, meaning. If we could just understand that, we would understand it all. It's no coincidence at all, and Ratzinger makes a point of this in his book, The Introduction to Christianity. He says, it is no coincidence at all that when the Gospels were written, they were written in the language of the philosophers, which was Greek. And as you would all know, the beginning of the Gospel of John is, in the beginning was the Logos. So immediately he's using this philosophical term to speak about Christ. But what's really important for Ratzinger is that he may be using a philosophical term, but this Christ is no concept. Christ is a person. And if you want to know a person, you don't just think about the person, you encounter the person. And this is something that's really fundamental to Ratzinger's understanding of what it is to be a Christian, to actually encounter Christ. And if we encounter Christ, we know that Christ is true, is truth, in fact, is goodness, and is beauty. So anything in the world that is good or true or beautiful is true, good, and beautiful because of Christ. They all come to us through him. Through him, everything was made. And so the more we know Christ, the more we can see beauty. And actually, the more beauty will affect us. And that seems to be part of his point as well. So Ratzinger goes back to Greek philosophy in order to see what he can find there. And the main idea that he finds there is from Plato. So I always find this very nice about Ratzinger, because there are kind of families that go together in Catholic thought. You've got your Aristotle Aquinas family, and then you have and Aquinas draws a lot from Augustine, but there's kind of another family, which is the Plato, Augustine, Bonaventure, and then I think Ratzinger is more in that family, and he would even say that himself. So he goes to Plato, and Plato has this idea that whenever we see something beautiful, we are enthused and we're ecstatic. We're taken outside of ourselves. There's this kind of rupture that happens within us. And he says it's like we've been struck and wounded by an arrow, and we don't know what to do with ourselves. And in describing this, he says that it's an arrow of nostalgia. And what he means by this, I'm not sure, I'd like to know what the original term was, because usually philosophers will use the term that came from Plato, which is an anamnesis, which means quite literally getting rid of amnesia. So getting rid of forgetfulness. And it's a longing for what we once knew, but we kind of can't see anymore. It seems to me like a kind of Greek way of talking about original sin. Like we were there with God in the garden, and then we were sent out. But we kind of remember what it was like to be in the garden, and that's where we want to be. And somehow the Greeks have that sense too, but they can't quite put their finger on it because they don't have revelation to do so. But there's something really human about what Christianity teaches. So Ratzinger then goes into how it is that a Byzantine theologian thinks about how the beautiful wounds us. His name is Nicholas Kabasilis. And he obviously greatly admires this thinker and says that Kabasilis, more than 1,500 years later than Plato, talks about how the beautiful wounds us, but that's a kind of gift to us because it reminds us that we don't have everything solved, that actually there's a destiny beyond this world that we are called to. If it were the case that when we see something beautiful, we think, great, I've made it. I don't have to do anything now. I'm there. Then we would have a problem. But in fact, beauty reminds us that we have a long way to go and that actually our fulfillment is somewhere else. So Augustine said, we are restless until we rest in God. And it's that kind of sense that happens with the beautiful. Because Augustine also says, so he starts his confessions with, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. He's speaking to God. And then when he has converted, he tells us about his conversion. He says, late have I loved you, beauty, so ancient and so new. So he has found the beauty that he's always been looking for. But then he realizes that that's not the end. He has a great deal of work to do in order to really continue to love God properly. So the beautiful wounds, but this is exactly how it summons man to his final destiny. That's a line that we could think about, I think, for quite a while. It's on the second page, sort of about almost toward the end, the second to last paragraph there. The beautiful wounds, but this is exactly how it summons man to his final destiny. It seems that Ratzinger is saying that we need to be pretty good at being open to beauty, seeking out experiences of beauty, not just because they're pleasurable, but in fact, because they wound us and because they remind us of how vulnerable we are. Vulnerability actually comes from the term to be capable of being wounded. And it's really important that we are capable of being wounded. There's no better time than in Lent to realise just how weak we are and how capable of being wounded. To be capable of being wounded is to be Christ-like, because Christ opens himself up to being wounded in some of the most brutal ways possible. Ratzinger then goes into the point where he says that it is so important to realise that beauty is a unique way of knowing because it is about experience. It's one thing to be told what beauty is, it's another thing to experience it. It's one thing to be told who Christ is, it's another thing to actually have a relationship with Christ. And this is where he's ultimately moving. So that idea of an encounter, I'm just moving over to the next page. Obviously, I'm not reading the whole thing to you. That would be a bit silly. You can go and do that later. It's more like a commentary, I suppose. So it's third paragraph down, being struck. Being struck and overcome by the beauty of Christ is a more real, more profound knowledge than mere rational deduction. Of course, we must not underrate the importance of theological reflection, of exact and precise theological thought. It remains absolutely necessary. But to move from here to disdain or reject the impact produced by the response of the heart in the encounter with beauty as a true form of knowledge would impoverish us and dry up our faith and our theology. We must rediscover this form of knowledge. It is a pressing need of our time. And that's probably the last point that I want to make, which is Ratzinger finds this to be a most pressing need because beauty, there are two aspects to beauty. So on the one hand, beauty in our age, in an age when truth has been undermined so much, may well be an avenue to bring people back to Christ. So in this age of, post-truth, untruth, alternative facts, everything else that we hear about, people have to some extent given up on truth. But they're still capable of being open to beauty. And beauty has this power to really strike us. So this is where the popes, for a very long time now, well, for centuries and centuries, have been real patrons of the arts and have really encouraged artists to present beauty to the world because it has such a powerful way of bringing us to understanding Christ and of having that encounter that can kind of wake us up and make us see that we don't know everything. So this is this first point then that Ratzinger says, in an age where people are using reason in all sorts of ways. He says in the ancient world, they used to say that reason has a wax nose. You can point it this way or you can point it that way. You can point it any way you want. It has to be rooted in something else. So reason might not be what we need on its own right now. It probably needs some help. And this is where beauty can help. And so that's his second point. How is it that beauty can help us? I'll come back to an example that he gives in a moment. But he says, and this is something that in aesthetics we look at quite a bit. So in the 20th century, some philosophers have said there can be no beauty and there can be no art after Auschwitz. So after the horrors of the 20th century, we shouldn't be enjoying beauty, we shouldn't be enjoying art anymore. And in fact, what we know, they say, after the 20th century, is that humanity is so rotten and miserable and ugly. That is the truth of things, if there is a truth at all. Beauty is not the truth, but ugliness and deprivation and horror are the truth. We've seen that now. Some of the thinkers of the 20th century have said. In response to this, Ratzinger holds up beauty in a couple of forms. So there's beauty in the arts, and then there's the beauty that we see in the saints. So beauty in the arts, he gives us a lovely example. I like to think of this one occasionally, where he says this: the encounter with the beautiful can become the wound of the arrow that strikes the heart, and in this way opens our eyes, so that later, from this experience, we take the criteria for judgment and can correctly evaluate the arguments. So this is on the, what page is it? It's the third page, at 2/3 of the way down. For me, an unforgettable experience was the Bach concert that Leonard Bernstein conducted in Munich after the sudden death of Karl Richter. I was sitting next to the Lutheran bishop Hanselmann when the last note of one of the great Thomas Cantor cantatas triumphantly faded away. We looked at each other spontaneously, and right then we said, anyone who has heard this knows that the faith is true. So how does he explain this? The music had such an extraordinary force of reality that we realized, no longer by deduction, but by the impact on our hearts, that it could not have originated from nothingness, but could only have come to be through the power of the truth that became real in the composer's inspiration. And then he goes on to give other examples of art in which this might be the case also. So somehow a beautiful artwork can take us right back to the truth. And it has a power to do so in ways that might not be possible through mere argument alone. The other powerful way in which beauty can shake us up, help us to see that probably it's still there even after the horrors of the 20th century, and even after horrors in our own century, is to look at the examples of those who, throughout history, have given their whole lives to Christ. So the saints. And he talks about this a couple of times throughout what we've looked at here, but I think it's really interesting that he ends on this point. And he refers to Dostoevsky as well. So Dostoevsky, the fantastic Russian novelist. So I'll just read you the last paragraph of the entire text. Is there anyone who does not know Dostoevsky's often quoted sentence, the beautiful will save us? Sometimes it's translated as only beauty can save us. However, people usually forget that Dostoevsky is referring here to the redeeming beauty of Christ. We must learn to see him. If we know him, not only in words, but if we are struck by the arrow of his paradoxical beauty, then we will truly know him. And know him not only because we have heard others speak about him. So remember, encounter is better than argument. Then we will have found the beauty of the truth that redeems. Nothing can bring us into close contact with the beauty of Christ himself, other than that world of beauty created by faith and light that shines out from the faces of the saints, through whom his own light becomes visible. So I think he's ending here with a call for everyone to lead a holy life and to be that moment of encounter with Christ in the world, because any encounter with saintliness is an encounter with beauty, and that beauty comes from Christ. So every saint leads us to Christ. So for those of us who, like me, can only sort of draw stick figures on a whiteboard when I'm lecturing, there is some hope. It might be harder to do this, but apparently what we need to do is that we need to love with the love of Christ. And then we will become beautiful like Christ and become moments of encounter, moments that will inspire encounter with Christ through that kind of life. So if I'm to summarise what it is that I think Ratzinger is getting at here, it's that beauty is a powerful way for us to know God. The person who is the most beautiful in the entirety of creation is paradoxical, because it's Christ on the cross, whose love is flowing out for all of us. He may look terrible, ghastly. There's nothing beautiful or majestic about him unless you know what it is that he is doing, unless you can see that love. And it's that insight that Christianity has into who Christ is that can inspire amazing works of art which should lead us to Christ, which can inspire hope in a world that otherwise just seems completely broken at times, and that can inspire us to lead lives that would hopefully give others a glimpse into the love that Christ can bring to the world, that healing love which both excites us and inspires us. So I think I'll leave it at that for now.